Thank you for tuning into A Game of Fate, an actual play podcast where we roleplay using the Fate system. This is the first ever episode of a ongoing Fate core campaign that I'll be running called The Path of the Lost. As I say, this is an ongoing story that will keep cropping up. These same characters and these same players will return every now and then. It's not going to be absolutely continuous. There will be other games in between, other Fate Accelerated games. If you want to know how the channel works and all the other ins and outs, I have recorded an intro episode. That episode is called What Is This Show? And you can listen to it if you want to know the details of how this work's going to work. But what you need to know is every now and then the Path of the Lost will appear as a new session in a small batch of episodes, 3 or 4 episodes, every now and then to continue the story. This is session 0, the first play with these players and these characters, to introduce them to the game, to explain how the game works, and to bring the characters together for the first time. I originally wasn't going to record this, but then I thought I would record it. Cool story. Anyway, for anybody that knows the Fate system will know that character creation is a big part of world building and a big part of the game. You can spend hours just doing character creation, not because it takes a long time to figure out all your stats and all your details and everything else, as it can do with games like D&D, but because character creation is gameplay. It is integral to playing the game. It is telling the story, it is building the world, it is in fact outlining the rules of this game. You don't always know as a GM what the rules of your world are going to be until the players have gone through character creation. It's really fun. It's a great way as well if you're just creating characters for anything. If you're writing a play or a story or a novel or whatever, it's look at the Fate system and go through character creation with a group of people. It's a lot of fun. But in that vein, I have recorded here a special intro which just introduces the characters a little bit, introduces the world, goes through all their various backstories. You'll notice that each character has 4 parts which represent the 3 aspects of their character, the intro and then the 3 aspects. Again, that only makes sense if you know how Fate works, but it is an introduction to the characters and hopefully it helps explain the world and a little bit of what we're going to be doing. We don't actually play the game in this episode, it's just an introduction to the characters, but hopefully it's interesting and it will help inform your understanding of the game as it goes forward. But I hope you enjoyed this and want to see more, and if you do want to see more, we'll just keep making it, we'll keep recording it. We'll have little story arcs and a big story arc and it'll move forward that way. As I say, thank you for listening to the show. Please do like and subscribe and find us on Twitter at Game of Fate Pod, or just search for a Game of Fate podcast. You can find us on Facebook and other things as well. I'm working on getting all the social media up to date. If you enjoy the show, then please share it with your friends. Tell everyone. Just throw people at us and say, hey, listen to this. If you're into movies, then please do check out my other show, The Deleted Scene Podcast, on Twitter at Deleted Scene Pod, and search for The Deleted Scene Podcast on iTunes and Stitcher or wherever else. It's just a few of us talking about movies and TV and web series and just rambling on. So anyway, here's your introduction to a little world I've called The Path of the Lost. The city of San Magdalene has become the technological hub of New Adira, and as far as most people know, that's all it is. But the truth is much more complicated. Before the tech giants moved in, San Magdalene was just another blue-collar port indebted to the mob. Another easily forgotten city where the rich lived in corrupted luxury at the expense of everybody else. But for whatever reason, that changed 30 years ago when large robotics companies started moving in. Every major breakthrough in the field has come out of San Magdalene, and the rich and powerful have flocked to the city in droves, building a new centre of wealth, literally on top of the old city, burying its past like a dirty secret, stretching the gap between the powerful and the people even further. Now San Magdalene exists in 2 halves. A shining utopia of high-rises, business centres, shopping malls and tourist attractions, contrasted with the remains of a broken city where all the dirty work still gets done, both legal and illegal. Much of the old city exists in tunnels beneath the new, temples, shops, factories, even relics of a long-forgotten, more secret world. Because there's another layer to this city, this world, hidden deep within its history. Through intention or perhaps just forgotten, it's hard to say, but something unusual has infiltrated this world. Those who know of their existence call them demons, drawing on myth and faith to explain what truthfully nobody can. Where they come from or how they do the impossible things they do are a mystery, but they live deep within the human world. Some peacefully out in the open, and some hidden deep in the shadows with dark purpose.
Born in the depths of San Magdalene, Yobanjo's only family was his mother, a well-respected madam of a brothel known as the Lighthouse. As he grew, he developed telekinetic abilities, wild and unpredictable at first, but his mother didn't seem shocked by this and trained him to use them effectively, allowing him to help out around the house. It was at this time he learned many of those who passed through the lighthouse's doors had unusual abilities of their own. But it wasn't until his mother decided the city was too dangerous for them to stay that Yubanjo learned his mother herself was more than she appeared. Yubanjo never knew who his father was, but he heard the story. He heard that his mother had once been a serious player in the demonic underbelly of San Magdalene, running the most successful high-end escort service before it was shut down. The details on that always seemed a bit of a mystery, but he learned a few things. Whoever orchestrated the attack wasn't the kind of person you could report to the police, and the attack left his mother with two things: a jagged scar down one side of her face, and him. On the run for reasons Yubanjo was too young to really comprehend, they eventually found safety in a jungle area of a land called Sabala after his mother reached out to an old friend, a doctor Yubanjo remembered seeing in Magdalene before they fled. He took them to a facility deep within the jungle run by a company called WX, where they stayed until a catastrophic event left the facility in ruins. Yubanjo's mother dead, and him on the run once more, but with a new companion this time, a woman named Donatien, who had also been a guest there.
Growing up on the isolated island of Scopuli hadn't been easy for Morgana. She had never really fit in with her family. Her mother ruled over the island with a firm, unquestioned authority. She, being a powerful demon the inhabitants of the nearby islands referred to as the Sea Witch. Infinitely old and able to control the storms that protected the island, she had long cut her and her children off from the rest of the world. The local legends kept the people of the other islands at arm's length. Stories told how the daughters of the island would sink ships and lure sailors to their shores, but the mainland and the rest of the human world saw these as little more than myths of the ocean. Morgana and her family never left Scopuli, and curiosity of the outside world was greatly frowned upon. Her mother often told the cautionary tale of how she was betrayed by a powerful king and, fearing for her life, fled to the island with her children. The way she told it, you would think they had been on the island for hundreds of years, but rumours abound that their self-imposed isolation was a more recent event. Some of Morgana's older sisters told of how they remembered speaking with previous generations of the family who spoke of being first on the island, and told stories of the mainland that differed greatly from the fantastical land of kings and queens that their mother spoke of. But it wasn't a bad existence. They wanted for very little. They had home and food aplenty, as well as hybrid technologies from the mainland, but it was stagnant. Her mother did indeed not appreciate travellers coming in too close, and ships that did were quickly lured into the shallows and wrecked. They were then looted for whatever could be useful, and the survivors taken before the mother of the island. Healthy men would more often than not be kept for breeding, and many others would end up as a slave workforce, though some were simply thrown back to the sea to let the water decide their fate. Growing up in this environment can certainly skew your view of the world, but nonetheless Morgana felt uncomfortable with the way her mother ran things. But she knew all too well that those who questioned her would too meet their fate at the hands of the sea.
Garrett had always been known as Fluke, luckiest bastard alive, his friends called him. Things have just always worked out for him ultimately. This has made him lazy. He's never had to worry about money or ill health. He's always stumbled upon a way to make ends meet, rolling from one job to another without ever finding a career or settling down. Garrett was born and raised in San Magdalene, and he loves the city, warts and all. In his younger days, Garrett had stumbled across some extremely well-paid medical experiments for a company called WX. They had put him through a variety of strange tests, logic puzzles, physical examinations, and scans, none of which was particularly straining. They seemed very pleased with the results, though Garrett didn't see much in the way of a logical connection between the things he was doing. They invited him back. He returned many times, happy to be paid for killing time, until one day the facility was locked up and there was no sign of anyone inside. Now, it was curious, but Garrett decided not to worry about it too much. He had witnessed all the great changes in the city in his 60-plus years. He knew all the ins and outs, all the hidden gems, all the places best left alone. This city, you see, it's more than a home to him. It's part of him. It keeps him safe, and it always has. Now, in his later years, Garrett has grown bored of work. He's taken to gambling, something he's unnaturally good at, as is the way of Fluke, and has grown an unfavorable reputation amongst the casinos and gambling dens of the city as the man who cannot lose.
Adam grew up on the outskirts of San Magdalene in a small farming community. It was quiet, peaceful, not boring but dependable. That was until the day of the accident. Adam was 14 and the abandoned quarry near the house was a favourite playground of all the local kids. It wasn't exactly the safest place in the world, but it wasn't a death trap either. Truthfully, nobody paid it much mind. Running through the central yard, Adam felt the ground disappear from beneath him as the ceiling of an underground tunnel gave way, plunging him into the earth below. He fell into a vast cavern filled with dusty old equipment and scaffolding, and as he lay there dazed and in pain, he looked to a rack of oil drums next to him with the insignia WX on them, as the rigging holding them creaked and groaned before slowly yielding to time and decay. The wood and metal that had held the barrels for so long buckled and splintered, sending the barrels tumbling towards Adam, where they broke open and spilled their dull red liquid contents all over the frightened child. Adam screamed as the liquid burnt his skin. His sight went dark and the sound of his own screams rose to a deafening pitch before he lost all sense of sound completely. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in the hospital, seemingly back to normal aside from a few cuts and bruises from the fall. When questioned about the incident, he was told that those who investigated didn't find any evidence of barrels or any strange liquid, and Adam didn't display any side effects of chemical exposure. Not yet, anyway. He insisted on what had happened, but it was dismissed as trauma from the nasty fall he had taken. Once out of the hospital, everything seemed to return to normal unusually quickly. Adam went to the quarry, but the hole in the tunnel beneath had been filled in. He had no proof of the story no one believed. That was until the chemical exposure began to take effect. Slowly, Adam's senses began to heighten. Sight, hearing, smell, even touch became increasingly sensitive, until Adam could hear the tiniest whisper from across a busy street, feel the smallest tremor through his fingertips, and if he concentrated, he swore he could even see through walls. Leaving the jungle facility, Yobanjo and Donatien, the two of them bonded now by a pact that she called marriage, but that didn't hold to any rituals Yobanjo was familiar with, had revealed herself to be something other than human as they wandered aimlessly back into civilization. They moved from town to town, city to city, all the while his wife whispering dark thoughts in his ear. Aimless and mad at the world, it seemed Yobanjo was now the only one who could see and hear his new bride, but he never questioned her existence. Living almost feral on the streets, Yobanjo began hunting criminals for sport, particularly pimps, his wife revelling in the bloodshed. But quite by chance, or perhaps by subconscious desire, Yobanjo found himself once more on the streets of San Magdalene. The trauma of the things he'd done and the childhood he was denied finally fell down upon him, and Yobanjo, now a broken man, turned to drugs and disappeared into the dark alleys of the city. Time passed, and Yobanjo found himself awakened one day by an elderly woman in an abandoned temple where he had made a bed for the night. Taking pity upon him, she introduced herself as Yamigi. Perhaps recognizing something in him, she took him under her wing and trained him in meditation and other ancient disciplines that slowly helped him rebuild his shattered life, cleaning him up and even calming the ever-present voice of Donatien. Eventually he decided to seek out his old home, but the entire neighbourhood had completely redeveloped. No longer a mock suburban hub, it was now a cheap tech district, and the house itself an unlicensed body augmentation shop offering knockoff cybernetics and robotics. Realising he will find no comfort here, he decided he must make his own way in San Magdalene and set about becoming a kind of wandering sage, helping those in need, perhaps to atone for his plentiful sins.
The day everything changed for Morgana began simply enough. The scouts spotted a ship crossing the outskirts of the island waters and reported it back to the island mother. Morgana and a handful of her sisters were sent to lure the ship into the shallows and wreck it. They were quite adept at reading and manipulating the thoughts and feelings of the humans, especially the men. They could almost do it without really meaning to. The ship was quickly lured into the shallow water by the combined power of the sisters' siren song and almost gently scuppered itself just off the shore to the island. The day's crew exited the ship only to be met by Morgana and her sisters declaring that they were now prisoners of the island, as they had done maybe a dozen times before. The crew were taken away to be judged before their mother, whilst the sisters searched the ship for any supplies or equipment they could make use of. But they were surprised. The ship hadn't come across them by accident. It had extensively researched archives on the island, a variety of maps trying to plot its location, and texts that spoke of otherworldly creatures and monsters Morgana has only heard of in stories from her mother. Shocked and confused, she and her sisters gathered up what they could and rushed to her mother's court as she questioned the prisoners. They presented her with what they found and for the first time saw fear in their mother's eyes. She flew into a fiery rage at the interlopers, screaming and demanding answers. They told her they were merely seeking to explore and understand, but she didn't believe them. She assigned Morgana and the others who had ventured onto the boat to take the crew and find out everything they knew while she thought on this, and that they were not to speak a word of this to anyone else on the island. This is how Morgana met James.
As San Magdalene became one of the technological centers of the world, Garrett became increasingly isolated from it with no family to speak of, and all his friends moved on to more traditional lifestyles. Long ago, the old fluke became isolated, a drifter going from one grift to another, always managing to make ends meet somehow. But he wasn't without enemies. Crime had risen in the poorer parts of San Magdalene as the class divide widened, and Garrett had lugged the money out of the wrong pockets of more than one card game in his time. This led to him having to pay off some non-existent debts to some unsavory people. One man specifically, Farah Navarro, decided Garrett owed him a favor and had him dragged off the street and into a quiet club where they could talk. But as luck would have it, the club was victim to a police raid. Unfortunately for Navarro, a supply of illegal weapons was being stored beneath the building, and he, his men, and Garrett were swiftly arrested and taken away. Garrett found himself thrown into a small cell in the old town police station to wait whilst the details were ironed out, and as he slumped down onto a bench on the back wall, aware that he had just dodged yet another metaphorical bullet. He wasn't alone in the cell, however. A young man lay down in the corner trying to get comfortable and had been shaken awake by Garrett's movements. Garrett smiled and introduced himself, and the young man introduced himself as Adam.
Adam had become quite a tearaway after the confusion and horror of his powers had fully manifested, using his abilities to pull off increasingly elaborate robberies, eventually gathering a small gang of 4 other disaffected youths around him. Using his heightened senses to avoid security and see through walls to plot entry to secure locations, Adam and his gang made quite a name for themselves on the streets, and through a pawn shop contact where they had been selling their ill-gotten gains, they graduated to dealing with a higher class of criminal. The jump was somewhat jarring, but having learnt of their impressively efficient success, Adam and his gang found themselves brought before one gang leader after another and put to task. It was a little more than they were looking for, but it also wasn't the kind of attention you say no to, and they were quickly embroiled in the criminal underbelly of San Magdalene. His team was set to task, independent contractors given targets to rob or items to acquire, no particular loyalty to any gang or organisation, but available to everyone. An unwritten contract that was drawn up before Adam and the others even had time to think about it. However, this was their speciality. That was until the Neptune Tower job. Tasked to install a virus into the CEO's personal computer atop the glass skyscraper of the Neptune Tower, Adam and his team made it all the way to the top of the building, only to find a hidden alarm system that was not in any of the schematics or on the brief that were given by their employer. The police were on site almost immediately, and Adam and his gang were forced to scatter. Unfortunately, Adam's luck had finally run out, and unable to keep track of all the sirens and movement with the alarm ringing in his ears, he crashed into one of the police units, and just like that he would be spending the night alone in a cell, until an older gentleman was brought in to join him. Taking to a more peaceful existence as the years passed under the tutelage of Yamigi, Yobanjo continued looking into his mother's past. But he soon found out he was not the only one looking into the stranger side of San Magdalene. He learned that WX, the company that housed him in the jungle, still had a base in San Magdalene, but couldn't seem to pinpoint its location. Keeping his ear to the ground, he eventually learned that WX ran ships in and out of the docks on a fairly regular basis, and he decided to stake it out and see what came of it. After a few days, a ship came in offloading a cargo with a familiar logo on it, and Yobanjo watched the workers unsure how to approach, or even if he should. Eventually the work was done, and the area began to clear, but as Yobanjo watched, he saw one of the workers leave on foot alone, and on a whim decided to follow. The man walked into the city, stopping to pick up some food, and seemed just to be running errands, so Yobanjo decided to take the chance and approached the man. The man seemed confused at first, but didn't seem especially shocked by any part of Yobanjo's story, and introduced himself as James. The two of them began working together. James was a relatively low-level employee at WX, and he wasn't sure he entirely trusted the company's motivations. In fact, he saw a partnership with Yobanjo as an opportunity to begin investigating further into the company, and so the two of them set about to do just that. Until James disappeared.
James explained to Morgana that he was part of an exploration team sent to find the island. He didn't know the full story, but the legend of her mother on the mainland was quite something. Over the following days, Morgana learnt much of the truth of the world from James, and the two of them grew even closer. He told her that if only they could get to his boat, they could leave the island, but she informed him his boat had almost certainly been damaged beyond repair. He said that's not what he meant, but that it didn't matter anyway. However, the idea of escaping the island with James began to take root with Morgana, particularly as her feelings for this man grew stronger with every passing day. The more time she spent with him, the more curious she became of the outside world. Knowing there's no way they would be allowed to leave by her mother, she stole James away from his prison, and taking a life raft from one of the wrecked ships, they set out onto the sea. They got less than a mile out before the storm hit. Neither of them skilled enough to manage the rising waves and torrential winds, they soon capsized. And though supernaturally skilled swimmers as Morgana and her sisters were, her and James were quickly separated in the chaos. She held on to him as long as she could, but he slipped away, leaving her with just his jacket. She searched for him as best she could, but he was lost to the sea, and distraught she struggled back to the safety of the island, only to find herself crawling up onto the shore at the feet of her mother and sisters. Her mother wouldn't even look at her as she screamed her disappointment as her sisters watched, some sympathetically, but some just with cold malice. Morgana tried to plead her case, but without even giving her a chance, her mother expelled the full force of her power and had the storm sweep Morgana up into the winds and flung her out to sea. The next thing Morgana knew, she was awakening on the beach of an unknown land. Still holding James's jacket, she clung to it for some sort of comfort, but it offered none. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she knew she was on the mainland now, and that she could never return home.
Being stuck in a cell with Adam didn't seem so bad to Garrett, who largely let life wash over him anyway, but Adam seemed like he needed calming down, so he set about making conversation, and they eventually moved on to playing games of chance that Garrett continually won. Adam became fascinated by it, even deliberately stacking the games against Garrett's favor to test his luck, and baffled by how Garrett won nonetheless. As they sat there, a blackout, not a regular occurrence in the city, caused the power to drop for just a moment, but long enough for the electronic lock on the overnight cell door to have a sudden glitch and pop open. They looked to it, then each other. Before Garrett wandered over to the door and peeked out, emergency lighting flooded the hallway, but any other electrical devices appeared to be down, including the cameras. Adam stared dumbfounded as Garrett gestured for him to follow as he exited the cell and made his way down the corridor. Adam followed reluctantly all the time, voicing his disturbance with what they were doing until they rounded into the reception area where a lone police officer was fast asleep, and both of their arrest reports were set on the desk, apparently not having been processed into the computer yet. Garrett grabbed his and passed Adam's to him before pointing to the fire escape. Adam stepped back, slack-jawed, as Garrett casually exited the police station before rushing to follow. If there were going to be consequences to this action, they never came, and Garrett knew he had made a new friend. Adam knew he had to find out just how far this man's uncanny luck could go.
Morgana knew next to nothing about the mainland. All she knew was what James had told her, so she set off to the city he called home, San Magdalene. Her only possession his jacket and the personal items that had been inside, including his wallet and ID. She found her way to his apartment and, after using her abilities to manipulate the landlord, moved into the address, perhaps hoping to find some comfort in the home of her lost love. But with no identity and no real-world connections, Morgana soon learnt she wouldn't be able to survive in this world for very long. As someone who effectively didn't exist in any identifiable way, finding work was going to be tricky, and Morgana eventually ended up on the wrong side of town. However, she was fortunate enough to cross paths with a small gang led by a sympathetic young man named Adam. He offered her some work as a courier and eventually as a gatherer of information once he learned she was quite adept at manipulating men onto her side. It seems Adam was keen to stay one step ahead of the people he worked for, and she set about seducing and gathering dirt on a long list of questionable characters about the city. The work wasn't exactly honest, but Adam paid cash and his small gang seemed friendly enough. It was as close to normal as she was going to get for now.
Adam, like most people who existed on the fringes of San Magdalene, had heard of the curious wanderer who just sort of existed as a kind of benevolent force on the streets. Stories seemed conflicted as to whether he was a dangerous lunatic or a mysterious soothsayer, but all said he had a strange and unnatural ability. After this, Adam was taken by surprise to find this man, Yabanjo, standing in front of him one day, having sought him out. It seems word had gotten out about Adam's abilities as well, albeit rumours in much the same way, and Yabanjo was curious. For whatever reason, Adam decided to be somewhat open with this strange man, perhaps figuring the consequences would be minimal. They got to talking, and Yabanjo seemed to think he could help Adam to focus his abilities, perhaps relieve some of the stress they caused him. With nothing to lose, Adam agreed to meet with Yabanjo again and learn the art of meditation, for whatever good it might do. Yabanjo was relatively secretive, but Adam did see that he had some kind of unusual abilities, but when questioned, quickly changed the subject. However, the meditation actually started to help. Adam found he could calm his abilities, even suppress them entirely if need be, and that he had in fact only tapped the surface of what he may be capable of doing. He had been keen to dispose of this strange, seemingly homeless man as a friend, but it seemed Yabanjo could be more useful than Adam first thought, so he agreed to keep up his lessons. The last time Yabanjo saw James was just before he was due to join a ship's crew heading out to explore some strange phenomenon that had been reported on the cluster of islands generally referred to as the Lost Way. It wasn't unusual for James to have to leave the city on the request of WX, but this was different. They bid farewell and James set off on his journey. When James didn't return after a year, Yabanjo started to worry. He knew it was likely James would be gone for some time, but this seemed a bit much. He went to James's apartment but found someone new was living there, a young woman, and it seemed his friend was lost. He decided to get proactive and went to the WX office James had told him about late one night, but the place was abandoned and he could find no trace of where the company may have gone to. Becoming frustrated that whatever thin trail he had been onto was evaporating before him once more, he felt the sadistic influence of his wife beginning to drip into his ear. He retreated, and during a meditation session with Adam, who had noticed Yabanjo was particularly tense, he ended up blurting out much of his troubles. Adam was shocked but confessed to also having a connection to WX. Not only that, but he had met another man who seemed to have unusual abilities like they did, though very different. Yabanjo was taken aback. Just like that, his fading purpose had energy to it again, and he requested introduction to this other man.
With a newfound friendship in Adam's gang, the Docks became Garrett's second home, though the other members of the gang didn't seem quite so welcoming. Garrett even bumped into the pretty young lady Adam employed as a messenger of sorts on occasion, and he couldn't pretend he wasn't curious about what Adam did exactly. So he set about trying to hustle her for some information. However, it seemed she saw right through him. Curiously, to Garrett, she then tried to trick him into helping her, and whilst there was something hypnotic about her words, he brushed the compulsion off. She seemed annoyed, but more than anything confused by that outcome, and they parted company, awkwardly. As well as that, Garrett had quite frequently spotted the strange, homeless-looking man that Adam hung out with, and was taken by surprise when the man approached him one day. With a host of unusual questions, Garrett humored him with conversation and casually mentioned the tests he had been a part of, the WX, which immediately piqued the man's interest. He began to ask for every little piece of information Garrett had. He offered what he could. The man seemed very calm, but also somewhat desperate. And Garrett didn't really know much, though he neglected to tell him the location of the facility he had been to, claiming he didn't remember, though that was untrue. Garrett, always on the lookout for a benefit to himself, decided that information could always be bought later once he knew more about this strange man.
Needing a break, Adam decided a poker game was in order. And since he had a number of players he suspected of hustling him previously, he invited Garrett to join. His plan being to sit back and watch as his lucky charm took the cheaters' money from right under their cheating noses, regardless of how much they tried to manipulate the game. After the first couple of players had lost everything and stormed out in anger, the game relaxed a little and Adam got to talking to Garrett about his encounter with Yabanjo. Much to Adam's surprise, he learnt that the two of them had primarily talked about WX. Garrett confessed to having lied about knowing where the WX facility was, and the coincidence was too much to ignore. Adam immediately called on one of his boys to fetch Yabanjo and bring him to the den.
And this is where we begin our game, at a poker table in Adam's den, where our four heroes are about to come together for the very first time. So tune in to the next episode of A Game of Fate to find out what happens when our story begins.